reason number 3 why I believe the Bible and why I think you should too is that Jesus is the most influential person in human history for good reason. Jesus Christ is the most influential person in human history for good reason. In 2013, Stephen Scienna and Charles B. Ward. Stephen Scienna is a computer scientist. Charles Ward is a Google engineer. Right? These two fellas got together and they published a book. They wrote a book that was published by Cambridge University Press just 5 years ago, 6 years ago. Right? Cambridge University Press is the oldest publishing house in the world and one of the most academically reputed publishing houses the world over. Right? So this isn't just some fly-by-the-seat of your pants, fly-by-night book. No. The question that they ask in the book is given away by the title, who's bigger? Where historical figures really rank? What if we could somehow rank who the most influential person is in all of human history? Who are the top 3? Who are the top 5? Who are the top 10? Who are the top 100 most influential people in human history? And with their computer background and their Google Analytics background, this was something that would have been very difficult to have done even 20 years ago. Right? But now we actually have ways of measuring by computer formulas, and they had all these fascinating algorithms, and then they had their sort of initial algorithm, and then they modified that by knowing that many of the most modern Google searches and other searches would be skewed toward modern figures, and so they had an algorithm for that, and they put it all together, and what came out the other side was the most influential people in human history. The New Republic wrote in December 4th, 2013, the year the book was published. Stephen Scienna and Charles Ward are keenly interested in, even delighted by rankings. In particular, they are interested in ranking people along one dimension, significance. Significance. Who are the most significant people in human history? Would you like to see their list? I'll give you their top 10. Here's the top 10. Here's the top 10, Scienna and Ward's list. Who's at the top of that list? Jesus. Now let me show you the rest of the list and I'll make a few observations about the list itself. Number 1, Jesus. Number 2, Napoleon. Number 3, Muhammad. Number 4, you'll be happy with this, Rochelle, William Shakespeare. Number 5, Abraham Lincoln. Number 6, George Washington. Number 7, Adolf Hitler. Number 8, Aristotle. Number 9, Alexander the Great. And number 10, Thomas Jefferson. Now just a few brief observations. First of all, note that many of those people are political leaders of some sort or another. Alexander the Great, Napoleon, Abraham Lincoln, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, political leaders, leaders of very powerful nations. Notice that also most of them are more modern figures, right? So Washington would be, comparatively modern. Hitler would be modern. Jefferson would certainly be modern. And Abraham Lincoln would be reasonably modern. Napoleon as well, okay? Like within the last few hundred years. Only 3 of those figures are properly what you would call ancient. Alexander the Great, Jesus, and Aristotle, right? With Muhammad coming somewhere sort of in the interim period, in the 600s, 7th century. So here's the fascinating thing. Why would Jesus be on this list? And he's not just on the list as one of the most influential people. Scienna and Ward said he is analytically, by an objective measure. Now, there are people who argue with their measurement, I'm sure there are people that said, well, if you tweak the list this way and you make the parameters this way, I would like to suggest that no matter how you rearrange that list, whatever your specific parameters are, if you're looking at significance in human history, Jesus will come out on top in any reasonable and defensible list. And he certainly did in Scienna and Ward's. Well, this kind of makes sense because Jesus himself, this obscure, nomadic rabbi from 2,000 years ago, first century Judaism, said these words, "And I, when I am lifted up from the earth," a reference to his death by crucifixion, "I will draw," what's that word, everyone? "I will draw all people to myself." Something about me will be attractive. Something about me will be drawing. Something about me will draw people to me. Which raises this very important point, a point that I have noted many times in my 20-plus years as a follower of Jesus. The transcultural popularity of the Bible, which of course tells the story of Jesus, is astounding. David, what do you mean by transcultural popularity? Well, that Jesus is not only popular within his own culture and within his own sort of group of people, Jewish people. Right, there's less than 10 million Jews on the planet today, but Jesus is not only popular among Jewish people. Americans read the story of Jesus, and Australians read the story of Jesus, and Ukrainians read the story of Jesus, and Japanese read and love the story of Jesus. Jamaicans read and love the story of Jesus. People from Afghanistan read and love the story of Jesus. People from New Zealand, all over the world. This is really quite fascinating because most classics, literary classics, I'm venturing out in territory here, Rochelle, I'm in your ground. Most classics are largely popular within the culture, context, and time in which they're written, right? And so Russian classics are largely popular in Russia. Now, there are some, of course, the Tolstoys and the Dostoevskys that branch out. But Norwegian classics, Norwegian pieces of Norwegian literature would be largely appreciated by, known by, and read by Norwegian people. So too with Japanese classics and American classics, and largely those classics remain within the culture and in the context of the situation in which they were written. There are some outliers, admittedly. But Jesus is universally popular, right? You'd be hard-pressed to find a country on earth that would not have followers of Jesus, even many countries in which it's illegal to be a follower of Jesus. Why should Jesus be so resoundingly and so radically significant? Well, there are lots of answers that could be given to this question, but I'd like to suggest that the best answer I have ever personally come across is articulated profoundly by James A. Francis. And he writes this. You might have heard this before. I just love this. I couldn't leave it out. Francis writes, "Here is a man who was born in an obscure village, the child of a peasant woman. He grew up in another village. He worked in a carpenter shop until he was 30, and then for 3 years he was an itinerant preacher. He never owned a home, he never wrote a book, he never held an office, he never had a family, he never went to college, he never put his foot inside a big city. He never traveled 200 miles from the place he was born. He never did one of those things that usually accompany greatness. He had no credentials but himself. While still a young man, the tide of popular opinion turned against him. His friends ran away, and one of them denied him. He was turned over to his enemies. He went through the mockery of a trial. He was nailed upon a cross between two thieves. While he was dying, his executors gambled for the only piece of property he had on earth, his coat. When he was dead, he was taken down and laid in a borrowed grave through the pity of a friend. 19 long centuries have come and gone, and today he is the centerpiece of the human race and the leader of the column of progress," writes Francis. "I am far within the mark when I say that all the armies that ever marched, all the navies that were ever built, all the parliaments that ever sat, and all the kings that ever reigned, put together, have not affected the life of mankind on this earth as powerfully as has that one solitary life." You can make the case as to why a Thomas Jefferson or a George Washington or an Abraham Lincoln or an Adolf Hitler or an Alexander the Great should be, in the top 10 list of the most influential and significant people in human history. They were leaders of powerful nations. How does this man, born to a peasant mom, obscure, dies at a very young age, never writes anything, never makes any great contribution, never makes any great, political contribution. Why should this man be the most influential person in human history? Well, I'd like to suggest it's because the story of Jesus is simply uninventable. The story of Jesus is uninventable. It's the story that no one could have written. The story that Plantinga said to remind ourselves, not just the greatest story ever told, but the greatest story that ever could be told. If you were going to create a story, if I was going to create a story, and we didn't already have access to the story of Jesus, just pretend that this whole story of God becoming a man and making his, dwelling among us, just pretend that you don't know that story. If you were going to write a story of a Savior, of a deliverer, of a Redeemer, you know what story you'd write? You'd write the same story I'd write. You'd write the same story that all the Hollywood writers are writing and the comic book writers are writing. You'd write a Superman, a Batman, an Iron Man. You would write a story of a deliverer coming to deliver in the normal ways that deliverers deliver. Right? Through force and through power and through stratagem and through violence. That's the story that you would write. You would not write a story of a man being crucified by the Romans, a man of obscurity and of seeming insignificance, saving the world. That's a story that you could not have invented. No one would have invented that story. And it's not just an uninventable story. It's not just a compelling story. I'm suggesting to you here this morning, it is a story and a life worth orbiting your life around. It is the best story. Now, we move away from the actual content of the story, the nature of the story, and I want to sort of pan out a little bit here and talk about the actual Bible itself. What about the evidentiary case to be built for the Bible in terms of its manuscripts and its authenticity? Can we make a reasonable case that this book even is? Why should we take this book seriously? I remember not long after becoming a follower of Jesus, one of my former punk rock friends who regarded what I had done in becoming a follower of Jesus as absolutely traitorous. They just couldn't believe that I would surrender my independent thinking and my free thinking to become a follower of Jesus, to become a Christian, to become a religious person. And one of the things, Mike Gray, great guy, one of the things that he said to me, and I'll never forget this, is he said, why should you take this book so seriously? I mean, why not make Green Eggs and Ham your holy book? We all familiar with that? Have you ever heard of the book Green Eggs and Ham by Dr. Seuss? Right? And it sounded, I remember we were sitting in a restaurant, and when he said that, he received a chorus of approval from the others at the table, you know, who were also similarly confused by and frustrated by my conversion to Christianity. And when it seemed as though he had dealt a death blow to my, folly, the folly of Christianity, why take this book so seriously? Why not Green Eggs and Ham? Why not make that your holy book? And on the surface of it, it seems like a reasonable question. I mean, why choose this book among the many millions of books that have been written? Except this. First of all, the story of Green Eggs and Ham is it's a nice story, as I recall, but it's not a story you would orbit your whole life around. It doesn't tap into the basic essence, as I'm suggesting here that Scripture does, of what reality is fundamentally about, both internally and externally. But the most obvious reason that you would not make Green Eggs and Ham your holy book, your religious book, is it makes no such claim to be a divine instruction or divine information. It makes no kind of claim, but when a book does make that kind of a claim, when a book makes the claim to be, in some significant sense, divine, from God, that's an extraordinary claim. And don't forget this very simple idea. Ordinary claims require only ordinary evidence, but extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. If I tell you that I'm a 46-year-old man with 2 teenage sons that's been married for 20 years, you probably would not say, I'm not so sure about that. Prove it. Because this is quite an ordinary claim. There are lots of 46-year-old people. There are lots of people that are men. There are lots of people that have teenagers, and there's lots of people that are married. So these are ordinary claims for which you would not ask for proof. But if I made an extraordinary claim, if I said I have a garage full of German supercars, or if I said I own my own private island, or I'm leaving this afternoon's presentation in my own private helicopter, these are unusual claims, and you would say, really? You have a private helicopter? You have a garage full of German sports cars? You really own your own island? You would want proof for that. You'd want evidence for that. Because the more extraordinary the claim, the greater the evidence to substantiate or to buttress that claim.